If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Night shift workers, what was the most paranormal thing to have happened to you? I work in a big old psychiatric hospital. One night, I was pulled upstairs to work on the detox unit halfway through my shift. Someone on staff has to go room to room and check on all the patients every 15 minutes to make sure they're breathing, not in distress, etc. I had just gotten on the unit and wasn't sure offhand which rooms were occupied, so I just walked by all of them. One room had the bedroom lights off, but the bathroom lights were on and the bathroom door was cracked open just slightly. I knocked and gripped the doorknob to open it. Something yanked on the door and slammed it shut. I heard something banging on the bathroom wall, like someone was punching it. I opened the door and no one was in there. One of the techs who had been there for 20 plus years said she knows at least one person died in that room a number of years ago. I'm not in the least bit superstitious or prone to believing in supernatural forces, but that floor reminds me of something that happened when I was a kid. My bedroom light was on. I have always slept with the light on, due to experiences I have had, and my door was open so I could see into the dark hallway. I saw a shadow walk from my brother's room into the bathroom and I was paralyzed with fear. At that moment I heard my brother bouncing on his mattress and loud banging on the wall that separated our two rooms. This was comforting to me to hear him as I was scared. This is something he did. He is one of those people who rocks in their sleep, and would occasionally bang his head on the wall. At that moment my brother walked out of the bathroom and stood in my doorway and asked me why I was in his room. So the shadow was actually him, but it was most definitely not him making the noises in the room. Next morning he didn't remember it. I work in a restaurant and all the bakery people who stay late talk about the ghost of a little girl, but I didn't know this when I started. It was the middle of the day but we were slow, so I was doing prep work by myself in the kitchen. I was at the prep table, kinda zoning out, listening to the distant music when I feel someone right next to me. Like a sudden presence. Then I swear to God I heard, in a little girl's voice, the most innocent "Hi Josh. My name, how are you?" I even felt her breath. It was so real and vivid, but when I turned around there was no one there. I started telling people about it and found out lots of coworkers heard the same voice. From everyone's story she, the ghost girl, seems really nice, but it still sent chills down my spine. I worked security at a youth camp that was closing down. Layout was exactly like a prison. Barbed wire fences around the whole grounds. Big double gates that only could be opened from the control booth. I would be the only one there set up in the control room on the 3 to 11 p.m. shift. All I did was watch movies on my computer all night. Place was already creepy just at sight. The control room was an enclosed room with a huge steel door as the only way in. On many nights I would hear someone trying to open the door, but the only way to open it was for me to buzz it open. Another night while zoning out to clerks I heard one of the doors in the hall open. I got up to look to catch the door closing, followed by a guy's voice that sounded like, "Hey, I just sat down and watched the movie." Not much I could do. The weirdest thing that happened was hearing what sounded like a mop bucket being rolled across the floor. When I'd get up, nothing. Happened a few more times until I went to check it out, and at the end of the hall the mop bucket was sitting in the middle of the hall with the mop in it but was completely dry. I know for a fact it wasn't there at the start of my shift. Other guards had some stories too. Place is now a manufacturing plant for medical marijuana. Used to work in group homes for individuals with developmental disabilities. This home in particular was considered a high support home as the individuals there were relatively aggressive and their needs were mostly behavioral. The home itself was in the middle of nowhere, 15 minutes from the closest town, no cell reception really, and surrounded by forest aside from a couple of other houses on the road. There were 2 overnight staff, usually one would be awake and one asleep and take turns. Anyways, the staff told me about one night where they heard noise coming from one of the people living in the house's room. I guess that person had decided to rip open a scab and use the blood to smear all over the walls of their room. One staff went in to deal with the situation, and the individual said, "Don't worry, they're coming tonight." The other staff walked back out into the open concept living room / kitchen / dining room to get the phone to call the on-call supervisor to let them know, since this required a lot of documentation and notifying the on-call. The staff noticed that the sliding door was now somehow ajar by about a foot, even though they had just been in that room and the door was closed and locked. When the other staff walking towards it to close the door, the staff noticed a wolf / coyote / coy wolf was slowly lurking on the porch towards the open door. They closed the door and ended up calling the police because they didn't know what the hell was going on. They had to clean all the bloody hand smears off the wall, and the individual didn't talk about it again. Just another overnight. Working EMS, and I was standing outside our station smoking a cigarette at about 03:00. Our garage and workshop were about 30 feet from me and the garage door started to open. It got about halfway and stopped. I opened the door into the station thinking it was my partner ducking around, but he was still unconscious on the couch and hadn't moved from the position he assumed a few hours earlier. The door suddenly begins to close on its own and I stare at the dilapidated building that held our ambulances and stock room. The heavy metal door next to the garage slowly opens and I hear a voice yell, "Medic girl. Come here." From the direction of the garage. It was loud enough my partner woke up and came outside wondering who was yelling for me. It was a gruff masculine voice and it called out again, "Medic girl. Come here." Both my partner and I heard it and we just stared at each other. The inside of the garage was pitch black so we couldn't see anyone. We called up PD and told them we thought there was someone ducking around in the garage and a couple of officers came up. We all started walking towards the garage when the door, which was 3/4 of the way open, just slammed shut. We all turned around and ran. One of the officers called the K9 officer and he came down with his pup. They were going to do a search of the building, but the pup wouldn't go any closer to the building than about 10 feet away. The dog got close to the building, fear peed, and jerked backwards so hard on his lead that his head slipped out of his collar and he ran back to the car, scratching to get back in. Not gonna lie, we ended up calling a priest because none of us wanted to deal with whatever was in that garage. I used to work in a psychiatric hospital. I would work on several different floors, wherever they needed extra staffing. So I was sent to work on the kids' floor and I was unfamiliar with this set of patients. One little boy, 8 years old, needed constantly observed during his stay because he was aggressive. When he's sleeping, this usually just means the staff can pull up a chair and watch him from his doorway. This patient's sheet reported that he has auditory and visual hallucinations. He would wake up throughout the night frequently by sitting up and turning his head from side to side, scanning the room, and then he would then look at me and say, "Oh, that was just you." He did this a few times and I just chalked it all up to having psychotic symptoms. Then I saw a dark shadow was around the room but the patient remained asleep. The next morning he wakes up and sits at the table on the unit. I try to start up some small talk and ask him how he slept and he said tearfully, "I couldn't sleep because the shadow people wouldn't let me sleep." Then he stared off into space and with a flat effect he said disappointment. Then looked at me and smiled. I was really weirded out by this whole shift and was telling one of the nurses who regularly works at the hospital and she said, "Oh, is sleeping in room, isn't he? Yeah, that room is haunted. Most kids have trouble sleeping in that room." Then she told me about how the children's floor used to be the old electroconvulsive therapy unit back when the technique had just been introduced and wasn't the most humane procedure. The building was built back in 1940s and this era is known for inhumane treatment of patients. Not a night shift worker, and after what I saw I don't want to be one. I was riding my bike down the road at 1 a.m. I'd just been to a friend's house and I was heading back. It was school holidays so I didn't think I needed a sleeping pattern. Boy do I regret that. Still don't have a sleeping pattern though. So I rode past a store that someone was locking up. When out of nowhere a cat just landed on this guy's face. I didn't even see it fall. It was just suddenly there. The guy yelled out, then pushed the cat off his face. He calmed down pretty quickly when he saw the cat and it just ran off. After the cat ran off, and the guy finished locking up, I finished laughing at him. He walked off towards his car. Suddenly the cat was just on his face again. It just appeared out of nowhere. There was literally nowhere it could have jumped from. And it just shrieked at him. It was like a high-pitched gargling meow of death and it was on this poor guy's face. So he pulled it off his face again, and it ran away. The guy walks towards his car. I'd stopped moving just to watch this all happen, so he waved at me. There's a cat sitting on his car. I don't know which crazy cat lady this guy messed with, but there was just a cat sitting on his car staring at him. I watched him pick it up, put it on the floor, get in his car and drive off like it was nothing. If this guy just reacted to this like it was nothing, I have no idea what kind of crazy stuff happens to him and I don't want to know. Was working at a copper mine in central Nevada. On a dark summer night I was told to go down into the bottom of the pit we were digging to fuel our diesel shovel. For reference, it's about a 10-minute drive from the top of the pit to the bottom. Anyways, nobody was working in that pit, so I was the only person at the bottom of that pit while fueling. A few weeks earlier we had dug up old mine shafts from the early 1900s. So the whole time I was fueling I felt like I was being watched by someone or something. I was instinctually looking over my shoulder every few seconds. I'm not a small person, I'm 6 feet 5 inches and was about 300 pounds, but I felt something malicious was watching me the whole time. I'll preface this that I genuinely am not a superstitious person at all. I used to work overnights alone in a group home, to pay for college. Just me, 5 feet 3 inches female college student, and 12 kids between ages 12 and 18. There was one other staff member from day shift usually physically present for ratios, but they were asleep and locked in an upstairs bedroom. It was pretty quiet work most of the time and I could get homework done during the wee hours, which was pretty handy. The house was donated to the agency because the family who had lived there didn't want it anymore, for some reason my boss wouldn't go into. Part of my overnight routine was to go down to the basement and finish up any laundry the boys hadn't finished during the day. Frankly, just being involved with the laundry of 12 adolescent boys was scary enough to warrant a story here. Anyway, there was a walk-in supply cupboard down there where we kept detergent, etc., so sometimes I'd have to go in and pick up some soap, etc. The storage area had its own light, but the basement as a whole just had a single bulb hanging over the washers. So coming out from the comparatively bright storage into the dark basement was always a little creepy. Multiple times I saw what I can only say looked and felt like someone in white, rushing past out the corner of my eye while bending into the washers fishing out clothes. It was particularly in one corner of the basement and had a very negative energy to it. Each time I would flip out and book it upstairs, locking the basement behind me. I felt stupid about this but really couldn't stop myself. When later I finally explained it to my boss, when telling him why I really wanted to stay out of the basement, he confirmed that the family had donated the house because their father had hanged himself from a beam in that exact corner. I had to do some middle-of-the-night behavioral experiments in mice in the oldest building at the medical school I used to work at. Basically, 8 p.m. to 3 a.m. I was just a visitor to this lab for a couple of weeks to help out a postdoc who'd gone on maternity leave. My regular workplace was on a different campus. I don't typically have a problem working at night, even though I'm a woman. I did it for years at various research locations without incident. I'm used to the dark and the night and walking through parking lots and parking garages alone. It doesn't bother me. I am one with the night. But this job was terrifying. My job consisted of walking into a room full of racks of mouse boxes after lights out to get to the testing room with the open field apparatus in it. I wasn't allowed to turn on the lights because it would disrupt their sleep/wake cycles, so all I had was a small headlamp with a dark pink film over the light to see where I was going. Mice can't see red light but we can, so to them it was still pitch dark. The testing room also had pink film over the fluorescent lights that made the room a dim red that quickly fell off, making the further reaches of the room pitch black. In case you didn't know, mice are awake at night, so imagine walking into a dark room full of tiny skittering feet noises. Hundreds of tiny little skittering feet you can't see running very fast all around you. I am not afraid of mice at all, and I knew they were safely contained in boxes, but even I got chills from that. However, it wasn't the scariest part of the job. This building had been built in the 1920s and had seen a TB epidemic and more. It was haunted. During the testing, I'd start the computer in the red room, put the mice in their testing chambers, and then go wait a couple of hours in the lab, go back to the red room, inject the mice with amphetamines. It was an ADHD study, then wait another couple hours in the lab, then go back, clean everything up, put everything away, and go home. By the time I left it was anywhere from 2 to 3 a.m. The building was empty, but it wasn't uncommon for me to see people in the halls out of the corner of my eye. When I looked directly at them, they'd be gone. Some of them would walk through the walls and just disappear. There was a constant feeling of being watched and followed, even in the newer adjoining building. The final walk through the ground floor of the main building to get to my car was the absolute worst. It was like a scene out of a horror movie where the dead come alive and start roaming the halls. I thought I could hear the screams of long-dead patients suffering in torment. The hair on my neck and arms would be standing on end as I rushed to get out. One night I really had to use the restroom on the first floor before I left. It felt like hordes of undead were closing in on me, telling me to leave, telling me to get out amid the screams of pain and anguish. I could not get out of there fast enough. Thankfully, I was never offered a night shift there again. But if I ever joined a ghost hunting group, I'd definitely know where to take them. I remember as a teen I needed some extra cash for my Warhammer 40k addiction and saving for my first car, and I got a job doing a solo overnight cleaning shift at a local supermarket. When I was doing the interview, the manager told me that no one has ever stayed at the job longer than 3 months. People would quit with no explanation. I promptly scoffed and said it's an easy enough job, I'm happy to stick around. The pay was amazing for my age and I lived around the corner. Well, my first night was going well. I started at about 11 p.m., let myself in and finished at about 5 a.m. When it got to about 2 a.m. I heard in the roof above me what sounded like furniture being moved around and lots of banging. I thought, oh, maybe there is another night shifter hanging around. Then I realized the whole place was locked and I had full view of the only entrance. So I ran to the stairs and, trying to be badass, I pushed open the door and all I see is a dark storage room filled with chairs and shelves. And No one to be seen. Now I was getting a bit freaked out and I finished my shift without issue. Then as the nights went on, more freaky shit started happening. I would be stacking a shelf and I hear crack and a ducking egg would be broken behind me. I would hear chip packets get crumpled and always movement upstairs. Like this place was empty but it was going nuts. I would get bad feelings in certain areas of the place until the worst of it at my 3-month mark. I came in and one of those eggs, the egg occurrence was common, flew straight at me and the door just blew the duck open. Now I could run. But no, I needed the money. So I stayed in this job for another 6 months. How I dealt with it, every night I would get totally hammered and I would do my job ducked off my face laughing at all the weird shit that would happen. That place was life-changing. There was so much more that happened, but that was the gist of it. I work in a campground and at times during high season, July/August, I finish work at 10 p.m. Note that I'm a young woman and I have a past way too common amongst us. I was finish up my work late at night when a family of 5 adults come into the office. It's a small cabin with wide windows. I tell them kindly that I am closing up in a minute, that the ground is full and we cannot accept any more customers. They start yelling in a language I do not speak. I'm a fluent French/English/ASL speaker, but I sadly haven't mastered Spanish yet, and I repeat myself. They eventually leave the office as I'm locking up after even asking if they needed help finding something. They said no and slammed the door as they left. I was a bit shaken up, as most of them were men. I call my boss on my cell while locking up and informing him of what just happened, but he wasn't on the ground that evening. He was with his wife at a restaurant. I told him that I was fine, just a bit rattled and to watch out for trespassers. Finally ready to leave, I turn around to the biggest window and 3 of the men just stare at me, smiling. I swear to gods I saw something shine in the moonlight, something in their hands. I lock every door I can and ducking book it to my loud car, which seems to surprise them. Sometimes, I really hate working evenings, alone. I used to work at a pub that was 2 miles from my house. My shift ended at about 11 one night. I stayed there for a couple of drinks, then started walking home. Now this had been an exceptional night for me tip-wise, and I had close to $400 in cash on me at the time. Between the pub and my house was exactly one street light about a quarter mile from the pub. The rest of the walk was in complete darkness. This was a dark night too. It was close to the new moon, and cloudy to boot, so it was almost pitch black. Now I live out in the boonies, so there isn't even much light pollution to help out. Not long after I leave the pub, a car slowly drives by me. About a quarter mile down the road the car slows to a stop, and it just sits there. I stop walking, and watch the car. It sits for a few minutes, then slowly drives away. A couple of minutes later the same car comes slowly driving back by me in the opposite lane. It gets by me, drives a bit down the road, and slows to a stop again. Then it does a U-turn and starts creeping back down the road towards me with the lights off. At this point I'm ducking terrified. I don't have a cell phone at the time, there's no one around to see what's going on. The car is between me and the pub, so I can't get back to the safety there. My house is still about 1.5 miles away, no way I can quickly escape there. I quickly run off the road into the woods and duck down behind a bush. I watch for the car, but it's too dark to see it with the lights off and bushes/trees/undergrowth between me and the road. I sit there for about 10 minutes, but don't see/hear anything. I'm about to make my way back to the road when I hear car doors closing. Now I'm really panicking. It feels like my chest is about to explode. The hairs on the back of my neck is standing up. I keep imagining someone sneaking up behind me. I stay hidden and hope to God whoever it is doesn't find me. I don't know how long I stay there, but I eventually hear car doors again, then cars passing by. I give it a couple of minutes, then ease back to the road. When I see it's clear, I haul us back to the pub and let my boss know what happened. He said then and there that I'm never to walk home at night again. Either him, his brother, or his mom will give me a lift home. When the other servers and the kitchen staff hear what happened, they all say the same thing. Never been that terrified before. I was working on a mine site that was shut down from production because the resource we were mining dropped steeply in price. On night shift, there were 2 blokes in the plant, a guy running the powerhouse, all about 1 kilometer away, and me, security/medic, and the only lady, of course, all alone in the gatehouse. The site itself was about 1.5 hours from civilization, and even when I was on day shift, it gave me the heebie-jeebies. There was no toilet in my office/gatehouse/medical center, so I would have to walk across to the adjacent administration building, turn all the lights on and walk all the way through it to use the ladies. I had worked in this field for a while at this point, at many different sites, and I had never been worried or frightened before, even when wandering around at night on my own. My desk has a window which has a direct view down the access road to site, and as I'm sitting on my computer, I see movement out of the corner of my eye. There is a man walking down the access road toward the gatehouse, at 3 a.m. My spidey sense is screaming at me, but I don't falter. I email the powerhouse and advise I have someone at the gate and can they call in and check on me in 5 minutes, and open the service window to talk to my visitor. As he gets about 20 meters from the gatehouse he vanishes. I shit my pants. I lock all the things and call the plant asking one of the guys to come over but not telling him why. He arrives and can clearly see I have shaken. I tell him what I have just seen. Oh, that's just Dave. Dave? Who the duck is Dave? He is that bikey bloke that died in the crib room. Didn't anyone tell you the story? Well, no, they hadn't, and assuming he was just trying to freak me out, I conducted a little Google investigation, and sure enough, a man was shot nearby and was brought by his friends to site for help. He died in the crib room. For the uninitiated, the crib room is the lunch room. So now I don't pee for my whole 12-hour shift obviously, and close all the blinds. On my next swing, this was a fly-in fly-out job. I come in on day shift and I am doing the rosters. The night shift medic tells me in no uncertain terms. Don't ever put me on nights here again. I refuse to do them. He wouldn't tell me why. It's okay, mate, I saw him too, just shut the blinds from now on. Worked night shift security at a cloth mill that's been around since the American Civil War. Had a good few spooks while I was there, but 2 really stand out. First, around 5 a.m. on a Saturday, I was patrolling the bridge that goes out over the river, and as I was going to unlock the gate to the bridge, I totally froze. I felt an incredible unnatural presence and looked forward to see, underneath a dim light, some kind of distortion in the air. You know, cloaking devices in movies where the car or ship or whatever phases out and looks like a mirror of what's behind it? Exactly like that, but with some kind of blackened aura around it. I waited a moment, staring at it. It slowly undid itself and I began to calm. I went about with my rounds, trying not to think about whatever it was. Second one happened about 2 weeks after. I was walking through the cotton opening room, and I was overcome with that same feeling that something unnatural or malevolent was nearby. I looked ahead and saw a small tuft of cotton floating in the air. Cotton often floats about in there, but this tuft was dead still. I walked towards it, eyes locked, waiting for it to move. No circulating air at that time of night. I waved my hands above, below, and to both sides of it, and yet it still didn't move. It was totally frozen in place. I turned to walk away, made a few steps, and whipped my head back to it, and it was lying on the floor. I have no idea what could have kept it suspended like that. I currently work overnights as a nursing assistant in an adult family home. It's small, so I work by myself. All residents have moderate to severe dementia, and it's pretty common for them to see things that aren't really there or to be unable to communicate what they are actually seeing, so I usually just play along in their reality but don't really pay attention to it. Except there was this one week where everyone on one side of the house just wouldn't sleep. They were all waking up every hour or so. Only one of the 3 residents was able to communicate verbally, the other 2 had severe enough dementia that they no longer were able to speak, and all she would say is that there was a man in the corner. Well, initially I didn't think anything of it, because this particular resident is also particularly susceptible to visual hallucinations, and I just sort of figured her wandering was waking up the other 2. But sometimes the other 2 would wake up first, and they seemed very agitated, so after about 4 nights I started wondering. I sat in the hallway on their side of the house instead of in the caregiver office all night, and didn't see anything. But they were getting agitated again. So I went outside, thinking maybe someone was out on the sidewalk. It's a locked and gated facility, so someone would have to climb the fence to get into the yard. Not impossible, but unlikely. Nope. Nothing there. But I shit you not, I swear when I looked inside I saw a man in the corner of one of the residents' rooms. It was only for a second. That resident went downhill super fast and ended up passing away about a month later. Still work here. This is my dad's story. As a teen, he lived in a really small town in Louisiana. His father took care of the cemetery grounds and dug graves for a local, old church, so my dad would help out for some spare cash. This church was in the middle of the woods, and none of the priests stayed in the area overnight. My dad and his friends would go to the cemetery and get incredibly drunk on weekends. They wandered around the cemetery, but were respectful enough not to disturb or ruin the graves. Well, there was this one bush near the new chain-link fence towards the back that my drunk dad and his drunk friends liked. They would sit near the bush and wait for it to start talking to them. They talked to the bush, and it talked back to them. My dad says he was so drunk that he couldn't remember exactly what it was saying, but they had conversations with this bush every weekend for months. Now, He chalked it all up to drunken delusions. Until his father told him to go get rid of the bush because it was messing up the fence, and starting to die. My dad did as he was told, slowly chopping it up. But something was out of the ordinary. As soon as he removed enough of it, it became apparent that there was a simple, flat gravestone underneath all of it. He couldn't read the words on it anymore, it was so old. They decided not to touch the bush and the grave any further. The bush never grew back, only a few stumps around it left. I've seen it. We live up in New England, and we traveled down to bury my grandmother's urn in that cemetery. My dad took me to the remains of the talking bush and grave, and was like, "Remember the talking bush?" Yeah, here it was. When I was younger, I had an agency job cleaning buses at the local depot. The pay was crap, but it was a chill job where you were left to your own devices most of the time. The fleet was mostly modern, but there were a few ancient double-deckers kept around for less grueling duties. One of those buses in particular was haunted. The other cleaner and I would often hear people walking around the top deck when cleaning the bottom deck, and when you were up on the top deck, you'd sometimes hear footsteps slowly coming up the stairwell. They would always stop once they hit the top step. Some nights you'd hear the distinctive creaking sound of the destination blind being cranked from the driver's cabin too, but when you ran down, the blind or its handle hadn't moved an inch. One night, I was on my knees sweeping up broken glass with a dustpan and brush when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Behind the seat I was sweeping in front of, I could see a pair of legs. They were as solid as any other pair of legs, and I remember what they were wearing very clearly: green corduroy trousers, dark socks, and brown brogues. Then they began to bend. I was shitting myself and fell back with my eyes firmly closed. When I dared myself to reopen them, there was nothing there. I finished as quickly as possible and moved on to the next bus. Over a cup of tea, I told the other cleaner I'd seen something weird on that bus, and she just looked at me and went, "Were they green legs?" I never saw those legs again, but apparently she saw them a few times. Always just the legs. She never dared to look up and just looked elsewhere until they disappeared. I was cleaning a bar in the middle of the night. This is an old building, now over 100 years old and over 90 when I worked there. The building was a restaurant/bar and then became a cafe/speakeasy during Prohibition, and there are remains of tunnels in the basement from bootlegging. Anyway, I was cleaning on the middle of the night and the only one there, and I came around the corner to two men playing pool in the pool room on the other side of the hallway. I knew they weren't really there, but they were there even after I squeezed my eyes shut. They were both in old Western wear, jeans, hats, one blue, one red plaid. Their movements were fluid, smooth and floaty, almost slow, but not as they played on the empty table. I wasn't scared, I didn't feel cold or threatened, more curious and disbelief. "Hello, can I help you?" I said as loudly as I could, and I started walking quickly towards them, almost at a charge. The one in plaid looked right at me, and as soon as I crossed the threshold and into the room they vanished. Used to work overnights doing phone support. Let me just say that the area in general we worked at has always had a weird vibe to it. Stuff that doesn't seem exactly out of place, but just abnormal in a way that's difficult to explain. To make matters worse, there's a cemetery about a mile up the road, and it can kind of get in your head when you're thinking about it. Off the top of my head, I've experienced weird lights in the sky. Not your typical that might be an airplane, but as in coworkers and I would be outside and see a light off in the distance hovering. It would move up vertically, make a sudden and quick horizontal downward slope, go up vertically again, and take off. Strange lights in the building across the street from us. Big building, not sure how many stories but very tall. Was abandoned up until this year for maybe 4 years or so. Occasionally lights would come on, go off, come on again. You could see what looked like people roaming around with flashlights. Would hear singing late at night outside, all throughout the year. Definitely a woman's voice, couldn't make out what was being sang, could never find out where it was coming from. Coworker doppelgangers. Stones would be thrown at us from seemingly nowhere. There is like a very, very small little pond next to the building, surrounded entirely by fence and high grass. Sometimes it sounded like something massive had jumped inside of it, followed by heavy sounding steps. So I work in the middle of the Navajo Nation at a power plant. Naturally it's kind of creepy driving to work at midnight. So here's a list of things I've seen. It was raining, I was driving down the highway after leaving a gas station. Jamming to some Ashley by Escape the Fate. My Spotify playlist is a very confusing place. I see headlights heading right at me. Me being me, I slam it. Going about 75 when suddenly the headlights veer off into the desert. But they were headlights, they were two obs, emitting only light off themselves and not where they were headed. They shot into the desert and I drove the rest of the way to work with my jaw dropped. Another night, I was driving to work, I was about a quarter mile from the entrance to the power plant. There was a car being me, we were going uphill, doing about 40. This blue orb comes out of the desert and goes through my car. As I made contact, all my gauges dropped to 0. Battery, gas, RMP, mile per hour, temp and oil. Everything dropped. For what seemed like minutes, then suddenly everything came back up and I drove to work. I told a coworker and he said he saw me coming up the hill but my lights went out. And the last light story, I was driving to work just the other day. When you're coming up the hill to work, you can see the wild stretch of the highway, which is 5 miles from town. As I'm starting the hill climb, I notice a car coming up pretty fast behind me. It got about pretty close. Then the right light went out, then the left. Which would have meant it turned to the right. But if it took a right, it would have gone straight into the desert. Now, the building I work is in also part of the warehouse. A few people have died here. One night I was on me lunch break, 15 minutes is more of a potty break, I was walking down the corridor and just past the women's bathroom. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a black figure standing in the doorway. My heart stops but I keep walking, I know it's either my imagination. I walk into the men's room, drop trough and start pooping. About 30 seconds into my poop, the door opens. It's 4 a.m., the warehouse is closed until 7 a.m., I am the only person back there. I hear footsteps walking and an overwhelming smell of a spicy men's cologne with cigarettes. The footsteps got closer, and stopped at the shower. Suddenly the lights go out, I pinched my turd, pulled everything up, didn't even tuck in my shirt, no time. I booked it out of there and finished my poop in the bathroom where I work. I didn't go back there for a few months, now I poop back there every day and just keep a flashlight with me. Overnight park patrol in a rural village, I had a nice little shack to sit in where I got to write my logs, listen to the radio, and watch TV, complete with 3 basic local channels, such joy. One night, I went outside around 11 p.m. to check trails and saw a coyote outside looking at me from about 20 to 30 feet away at the edge of the trees. I didn't think much of it because it was just a coyote and it went back into the woods when I was walking down the steps to start my walk. When I went back out around 1 o'clock, I saw 2 coyotes in the same spot staring at me and they didn't budge. I made a few noises to try and spook them back into the woods, and it worked. Fast forward to around 3 o'clock. I opened the door to go back out and they're right at the bottom of the steps. Scared the shit out of me, so I stomped my foot and yelled, "Get out of here," and the one in front started coming up the steps. I closed the door and decided, screw it, no more walk-arounds for the night. I heard pitter-pattering directly outside of the door for a good hour, and just before the sun came up I heard barking and growling as if they were fighting, but it didn't sound like it was right outside of the door. I looked out the windows which faced the opposite direction and didn't see anything. But yeah, I decided that was the last night I was doing that because I'm not ducking around with eastern coyotes. They're not afraid of people and I didn't want to take any chances. Sometimes an animal can creep you out more than anything, and that's what happened to me. I'm a cop. There's a wooded area in my city that sits on top of a mountain. There's a clearing in the woods that opens up to a sheer cliff face overlooking the next town over. When I was growing up it was a popular place for kids to go and hang out, drink, have bonfires, that sort of thing. We called it Recreation Point. Several people died there over the years. Some jumped, and some just drunkenly stumbled over the edge. A few years ago, whoever owned Recreation Point sold the land to a real estate developer who cleared out most of the woods and turned it into an upscale mountaintop housing development. The area leading up to the cliff is still wooded, and the trail is still there. One night at work, I was bored and feeling nostalgic, so I decided to go check out Recreation Point. I hadn't been there since high school, so I figured I'd go have a look, under the guise of looking for trespassers. The woods start at the very back of the neighborhood. I parked at back of the neighborhood and started to walk through the woods toward the cliff. At the time, the neighborhood was still under construction, and there were no finished houses anywhere near the woods yet. There were no cars parked anywhere close to the woods, and this neighborhood is on top of a very sparsely populated mountain that's not really within walking distance of anything. Since I didn't see cars nearby, I was fairly certain that I wasn't going to run into anyone in the woods. That is until I started hearing voices in the distance. I could hear 2 distinct voices. One male, one female. I was a bit too far away to make out what they were saying, but they were clearly voices. They sounded like they were coming from the clearing. Probably some kids up there hanging out, I thought. I'd just tell them to leave and be done with it. The woods and the darkness were still blocking my view of the clearing, but it was obvious that that's where they were coming from. I got closer to the clearing and the voices got louder. Finally made my way to the end of the trail into the clearing, and silence. The second I stepped into the clearing, the voices stopped. There is one trail leading in and out of that clearing, and I was on it. The only other way out of there is to go loudly stomping through the thick underbrush. Or over the cliff. It was a quiet night, I would have heard them if they had darted into the woods. I looked around, made absolutely sure there was no one hiding in the clearing, and decided that this was not a place where I wanted to be. I made my way back down the trail toward my car, moving faster than I'm comfortable admitting. I don't scare easily, but that had the hairs on my neck standing up. Especially when I heard the voices start again, coming from the clearing behind me. I don't believe in ghosts. Logically, I know that it was probably my ears playing tricks on me, or birds, or sound carrying from a house in the distance. Some rational explanation, but I know what I heard, and I know it completely stopped the instant I set foot in the clearing. I don't know. Kinda weird. Used to work graveyard shift at a 5-story hospital that had a haunted room on the second floor. It was room 220, and so much things have happened to patients in the past that used that room that the staff eventually learned to just avoid assigning it to anyone. I would say 90% of the time, that room would always remain vacant while every other room on the second floor would be assigned 1 or 2 patients. The numerous complaints that I've heard in the past from patients or the staff that entered that room were, 1. Indistinct giggling and laughter of children through the wall, even though both adjacent rooms were occupied by grown adults that were too drugged up on pain medication to even wake up, let alone giggle. 2. Scratching on the bathroom door. Like deep and long streaks. 3. An adult woman crying. 4. Cleaning equipment falling down or knocked over. 5. Apparitions. A staff got a bit frisky at work one night and snuck off with her boyfriend when he came to visit her. Guess which room they used? Yep, 220, didn't turn on the lights and close the door behind them to fool around. Not 10 minutes after we wondered where she disappeared to, you hear the most deafening shriek that ever graced the second floor, and they both ran out the room in horror. The female staff was hysterical and her boyfriend was as pale as a corpse. Apparently, just moments before they were about to get nasty on the bed, they saw a middle-aged man standing over them and staring at them. We called security and they immediately began searching the room and found absolutely nothing. Female staff was reprimanded and she avoided the second floor like the plague. Now for the story. This was told by a doctor who worked at that hospital for 15 years and was apparently there when the incident occurred. Honestly, I feel like he was just dicking with us and read one too many creepypastas. Story goes that 10 years ago, that room was assigned to a patient with late stages of juvenile onset Huntington's disease. The patient was a 28-year-old male that was pretty much transferred to our place as a vegetative state. The guy was on life support and seemed like he was only there so that his family can buy a few more days to decide whether or not to pull the plug. Sounds horrible, but then again, it's a horrible disease. Anyways, one night while a nurse was making her stops and checking to see everyone was still breathing, she finally gets to room 220 and there, standing half naked, was this guy writing on the walls with his own blood. It wasn't even coherent words, but apparently scribbles of random signs, numbers and smeared bloody handprints. The nurse freaked out and tried to make him stop, but he drew out a piece of glass and started brandishing at her. She ran out the door and quickly called security. But when they came, the patient was already dead on the floor, lying in a puddle of his own blood, severed his radial artery and bled out. Security called the police and they came to investigate the room and question the nurse, who is now a nervous wreck, and all the staff who was working that night. It was eventually ruled as a suicide and the room was scrubbed clean. Used to do K9 security for many years. I don't particularly believe in paranormal stuff, but I did get the heebie-jeebies a couple of times. There was one site I used to patrol with my dog a few nights a week. It was an old historical farmhouse. From the main road, there was about a kilometer walk down a beat-up old dirt road with woods for a couple of 100 meters on either side. More of a path nowadays than a road. People talk of it being haunted if you believe in that kind of thing. One night it was really dark out. Can't remember if it was overcast or if there was no moon that night, but it was black. About 2/3 of the way to the farmhouse, my dog starts acting a little weird. I can feel him getting tense through the leash. He starts to let out really low growls every other step, and I can see his ears are twitching as my light swings back and forth. It's dark, but I'm sure his hackles are up. Maybe 100 meters or so after I started noticing him wigging out, he surfs out in front of me, which he only does if there is a perceived threat. He stays about 2 meters in front of me for a little bit and then just stops and starts growling at the darkness. Of course I am scanning with my light, but can't see anything. After years of working with Brew, I have learned to trust him like I trust no person. During one of my scans I see about 6 sets of eyes reflecting my light in the woods. I am certain it was coyotes, but damned if I didn't get the wicked shivers up and down. Brew and I retreated and went back to the car. Wrote it up as a clear patrol. Supernatural or not, I'm not letting my partner scrap it out with half a dozen ghost coyotes. I worked at Kohl's for 2 years, and right before Christmas, there would be a shit ton of new merchandise, so they usually had a team of about 12 people stay overnight one night and get the new Christmas merch out. I volunteered and we were winding down at about 2:30 a.m. I'm in the back near the bedding, which in my particular store was right beside the stock room in the back corner of the store. There's an end cap with some picture frames that were on clearance to my left, and I'm trying to stuff in some comforters a few aisles away. I get done and back up to look at my awful job, and a picture from just tips over and crashes to the floor. No one was around me. Nothing even touched the picture frames. I was too tired to care, so I went to the back to grab a broom and dustpan from the housekeeping closet. This closet is in the way back of the stock room. And we have these conveyor belts that you hang clothes on, and we'll take them around a track close to the ceiling so our stock room wouldn't be packed with clothes. Housewares and stuff were on the shelves, but the clothes hung in plastic bags from the conveyor belt at the ceiling. So I turn the corner to the closet and there's one bag of women's clothes just swinging away up above me. No other bags were swinging, and this thing was loud. If anyone had just used it, I would have heard. By now, I'm wide awake and freaked out. I grabbed the broom and ran outside to where the broken picture frame was. But it had been picked up. There was no glass, despite me hearing it shatter, and I couldn't get any of the other employees to admit they cleaned it up. I never worked an overnight shift after that, and I always got super creeped out using the conveyor belt. I worked night shifts in an open pit mine, and a big part of the job is driving around and making sure what happens the way it should. This also involved driving around the mine because you can't get anywhere without a car. Loads of cats and dogs would suddenly streak across the roads, and their eyes would catch the beams from my headlights, making it creepy AF. So I commented this to the person sighting at the back, and he replied, "Yes sir, creeps me out all the time as well." When I drove back to the main office after my rounds, I realized that I was alone in the car to start with, and that I never really stopped for anyone to get in. What's crazier is that I even corrected the guy at the back, telling him to put on his safety glasses. I saw the guy had his glasses off through my rear view mirror. I never look at mirrors now when driving around during night shift.